Hi, everybody. Welcome to your next session, next lesson in this series of working with oils and surfaces. I think this one will be interesting because two things. One is it's a different surface, obviously, and the second thing is that the way we're going to approach it will maybe take a little bit longer. The subject is an apple. Or apple skin, I suppose more appropriately, we're going to look at an apple, but try to look at what makes it have that gloss, that shine, and so on. So that's what I'm saying. It's different from maybe previous exercises where we've been looking at crinkly subjects that have a lot of activity in them. This is all about smoothness, I suppose. But rather than doing this into a wet into a one-off technique, it will involve stopping and letting paint dry and then working on top of it, which is, I think, a nice development, something just to change the way you manipulate the paint. But the principles will be the same. The idea will be the same, that you look at shape, you look at the tones, you look at the edges where one tone color blends towards another, how that happens, and you look at the marks, if there are any other marks on the surface of the object, all building together hopefully to create this illusion of the object itself. Keep this in mind when you're doing this. It's very important that what we're doing here, I'm not showing you the only way to paint an apple. By any means, there are a million ways you can paint apples. We all know that. And this is not the way I think you always have to paint an apple. What I'm doing is, like all of these exercises, giving you a method, a step-by-step method by which you can break things down in a way that allows you to create the illusion rather than being lost in how do I start and what do I do next. If you follow a certain pattern, you're going to get some sort of result, and that's the basis. After that, you can develop it and change it, whatever, but at least you have that confidence that you know a way. There's one way that I can get something to look like an apple or a leaf or whatever it is. So that's the idea running behind this. So focus on that and not anything else. What I'm doing right at the minute is just trying to bring up the image. And here's an image, one color, one in black and white. We will be using color in this exercise, okay, but we'll be starting essentially with black and white. In other words, basically what we're going to be doing is going back here to the techniques of the old masters, which was to create a monochrome underpainting, a black and white or gray underpainting, and then apply color and so on later on. If you remember, if you go to my the YouTube channel of mine, you'll find a video, and I think it talks about staining color over grays, and how you can create different tones. So have a look at that as well as this, and all been well, that'll pull together. But as always, we're going to try to start with the STEM idea. So S is shapes. So let's just simply look. I'm going to look initially. We'll look at the color one initially. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my wee pen here. And I'm going to try and take a sort of a medium gray color so you can see it, but I don't want it to be too strong really. So I've got my wee pen. What I want to do now is look at that red apple and see if I can break it into separate shapes. Can I see different shapes? In other words, can I see different darks and lights? And we can do it in the black and white one actually as well, but we'll just start with the color. If I start with the darkest, and you and I might be, sometimes people see other subtleties that other people don't, so don't panic about that. Find your own way. However, what I'm saying, for example, I'm going to draw around this gray line here, an area that I believe seems to be very, very dark, quite dark. You see that? So in other words, if I had to create a boundary around the darkest bit, that's what I think I'm seeing. Okay, I'm just making my pen a little less thick there. Then for me, what I'm seeing is another area here. It stops about there and goes in there and round here. In other words, this little area there, there's one there, there's two. Let's call it, actually we could write that, I suppose. Two. You know, and yes, you may see subtleties with them. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. Then we could say, all right, we obviously have this light area highlight. So let's draw a line around there. Call it 3. It's just for convenience. And the area around that is kind of similar in tone, similar in gray. So we could say, well, look, that the rest of that is all the same. So we'll call that shape number 4. And then up here, there's a little paler little area around the edge of there. If I bound that, you see it's like a purpley color there. So let's call that 5 there. And then in here, yes, I know there's streaks and whatever, but we might be able to say, well, let's call that one area. And there's a little yellow area that's separate. So look at 6 and 7, whatever. And there could, of course, there could be more. If we start looking into it, we could start to see subtleties, but we're going to hopefully create some of the more subtle things later on. We're trying to split this into its simplest form there. So there I see 6 or 7 different little bits of shading. Now, if you wish, I'm undoing this. Let's go to the black and white one just for the sake of argument, because we've ruled out color. You could simplify it even more. We could say, okay, let's draw around here and say, there is kind of the one similar to the first one there that I seen. There, let's say that's 2 in there because it seems a bit lighter on it. Let's say that is 3. And I know there are subtle darkers, but we can, let's say, put those in later on. Let's put, obviously, the light area. There's another piece of the jigsaw. And we might even say, well, look, let's call that whole rim area up here. See up near the stem coming out? It's actually nearly, we could say, well, let's call it the same. And then we have our little dark area. There's number 6 or whatever. So you might see it as less or more, whatever, but break it down, look at the image like this and create these, because that's what we're going to be doing when we start to paint with black and white. What we're simply going to be doing is trying to make various shades of gray, basically, and put them side by side to begin with. And then we're going to look at the edges. So let's undo that. So we've kind of seen the shapes that we can draw in, the jigsaw shapes. What about now the edges of those shapes? Well, they're not hard edges. We know that, obviously, because, I'm going to draw a line around there. There's between 2 edges. Hopefully you can see the gradation from the left, right side to the left, that it gets from dark to light. So where there are 2 shapes side by side, they blend together extremely subtly. And of course, that's why the apple looks shiny. So we're going to be blending soft shapes this time. Soft edges, pardon me. Okay, so we've got shapes that we've seen. We've decided what the edges are going to be like. I'm just getting rid of that. So we've got the shapes, we've got the tones. So dark, medium, lighter, so on. We're going to try and create all these tones, and we've got the edges. So what we're left with, which will come later, are the marks. And I suppose if you look here, even still at the black and white one, if you wish, you see little tiny dots and things that give us a clue about the nature of this apple, and the streaks on the rim of the apple, let's call it. You can maybe see them better on the color one if you look there. These little streaky patterns and the little speckly areas that you get on certain apples and so on. So there are a few marks. Those marks will be going on top later on. What we want to begin with is the fundamental thing, the big solid mass. Let's make it look like a solid object. Then let's decorate it, for want of a better word. Okay, always do that. Don't launch into painting of anything obsessed with the pretty decorative parts of it. literally the surface, because you're not really telling anybody about the weight of the object. So get into the I hate to use the pun, but I was going to say get into the core of it. But being an apple, that's a terrible pun. Forgive me for that. Anyway, there's where we're going to go about this exercise. Okay, that's where we're going to start, and we're going to start with black and white. So I'm going to start now and let you watch me painting that, and let's see how we get on with that. Okay, good luck with that. So what I have here is the basic framework, if you like, and just to run through a few things. What I have to paint on is actually, I'm actually using a piece of old watercolor paper. It wasn't tremendously expensive, which has been primed 3 times with white acrylic primer, and then given a coat of this. I think it was maybe a burnt umber, a little bit of blue in it, maybe in white, simply just to get rid of the white. So I want to be painting and working on a darker background, which is not pure white, and a fairly neutral grayish color. So, you know, the color is not absolutely essential. As long as it's a fairly neutral gray color, don't undercoat with pink or purple or yellow or something like that. Always have a nice neutral color. I'm starting to draw here, as you can see, with just a piece of white colored pencil, my outline of the apple. Just to run through a couple of more things actually while we're here. In terms of brushes, what I'm hoping to use, and we'll talk through this as we go, really what I have here is a nice flat, it's maybe not quite 1/2 inch, you can see against my thumbnail there, nylon soft, not too expensive, but works very well for blocking in and for maybe blending as well. I'm using again about a 1/2 inch a filbert brush, which is rounded at the top, as you can see, and straight at the sides. That's what a filbert brush is. It allows you to get into certain curves and things, and it has a sort of best of both worlds in some ways. Now I'm also using a little number 2, I think it is, soft nylon round brush. So all the brushes are fairly soft. The filbert brush, I think, is a bristle hair brush. But really firm nylon brushes work very well, because we're going to try to be creating a nice soft finish on this. So at the moment I'm working with 3 brushes, and I'll add on any others that in the video if I happen to use some others. Okay, that's the surface and the brushes. Paints, we're just going to be using black and white. As I said before, we're just going to be beginning, there you are, with black and white paints. And medium wise, what I'm using in this jar, you can see that honey color. I'm actually using Liquin, which is a resin based medium, which dries really very quickly with oils. Now that's not essential for this exercise, but it's very handy because we want to get through this, or I want to get through it to show you the next stages. So that's why I'm adding just Liquin when I do blend the paint down. You can use a little turpentine, and that will just thin the paint when you need to thin it, because we mightn't be thinning it overly. But Liquin or a little linseed will be needed later on, but you'll see that in the list at the start of the video, and hopefully you'll see as we develop when that comes into play, as it were. So we've got, I think, pretty much everything together. What I'm going to do now, simply based on the little analysis we did earlier on, is just block in. I'm going to simplify this and literally draw shapes like we did in the little digital explanation earlier, to get us started. So again, I'm not stressing that this is the only way to make a painting of an apple, but for the purpose of discipline and exercise and seeing results, try to follow this if you can. Okay, so what I identified, you might remember, was that I saw an area, again like a jigsaw puzzle. It went round like that, came down. I felt there was an area came in there, and then around like that approximately, and I saw that whole area is really very, very dark. Then I saw an area, I would say in here, that little area here, is very slightly lighter. Then I'm going to split this into two parts just at the moment. One will of course be the highlight that we identified, which is up here. And again, these are little sort of jelly bean shapes. And again, you don't need to use a pencil all the time. I'm using it so that we can see it for this exercise. And I'm going to have this as a slightly lighter color. So very dark, slightly lighter, lighter again, and highlight, very, very light. And then we're going to come up here, and around here, this is where we have a very light area here. So I'm just going to block that in, that'll patch there. And then back in here, there's a very, very dark area right in the rim of the apple. So we'll work with that at the moment and use that as a basis of how we block in tones, okay? So we're going to get started in a moment. I'm going to mix different grays. And again, for this exercise, I don't think it's worth being overly concerned that you're exactly matching the gray that's on the photograph. If you can try and do that, that's great. But remember, what our objective here is to try and create a nice rounded solid shape. So if your solid shape happens to be a little bit lighter and darker than mine, that's okay, as long as you have that solidity. And we're trying to get that illusion of the skin of the apple. So, you know, don't let that hold you back too much. But anyway, what I'm going to do is start in a second, block this in, and then you'll see where we go from here. So what I'm now going to do is block in the darkest, medium, slightly lighter, and highlight around these shapes that I've created. And what I've been doing, actually, I've just mixed a range of grays, so you can see hopefully the darkest, slightly lighter, lighter, much lighter, virtually the highlights. And just in the background, obviously, I've got my black and white if I need to sort of add more. But just to give me a start, I did that. So what I'm going to do is take what I perceive as the darkest area, and I'm going to put on a dark gray, okay? And you can hear, I hope, how thin the paint is. So this is not by any means thick paint. Certainly at this stage, it's not necessary. But let's say I was to follow, generally speaking, that little shape that I created at the beginning, the sort of jelly bean shape, as I call it, and around there. I'm not going to, you're interested to see, I'm not necessarily going right to the edge of the line. And one of the reasons for that, it's not essential, but one of the things I find helpful is when you actually leave a little tiny gap, because we're going to blend these together at some point, it allows a little space for blending to happen. So what you've noticed here, what I've begun to do now, I've drawn out the little shapes, these jelly bean shapes, as we were referring to earlier, where I believe the dark, the light, middle, and so on are. And I've begun, you can see, to block them in with various shades of grey. So what I'm going to do is I believe this big area is really dark grey, so I'm going to block that in. Then the little area here is slightly lighter, and so on. All of these things that we kind of analysed at the start of the thing. So what I've done, just to maybe speed it up for myself in a way, is make some greys. You can see there on the palette, dark, medium, light, very light, so on. And obviously I can mix other variations as I go if I need to. But what I'm doing here, I started here, and what I started to do was just get in this, what I believe is a dark area, this sort of, again, this jigsaw shape area here. So I'm just deepening it down a little bit more. And, you know, in a sense, all we're doing here at the moment is it's colouring in, but what we're trying to do is measure as we go. So we're telling ourselves where we believe different values lie. So let's, for instance, say that. And when I've got, or whilst I've got that dark on there, I might as well, you know, block in the areas, the other areas where I believe dark to be. So in the little rim here of the where the stem is, there's a lovely little bit of dark there. So I might as well use that. And on the edge just above here of the rim, there's another little bit of darkness there. I might as well put that in, that little shape there. And now what I'll do is move down to the next darkest, or next lightest, I should say, which I think is kind of here. So I think it's maybe slightly darker than what I've got. So I'm going to deepen it slightly more and put that grey in here into that area. So it's like a teardrop shape there. Then this area, I believe, is beginning to get a wee bit lighter, and I'm going to see that as being one lighter tone here. So we'll fill that shape in, and eventually we start to see at least the outline of an apple appearing, which we're not seeing it right at the minute, but you will do. And while I have that mid-tone, actually, I'm aware that there's some of that up here. So around the rim here, there's a little block of that lighter tone, let's call it mid-tone, whatever, there, and a little bit there. And then what I'm going to do is go in with what I feel is very, very light, which is here. Just very, very thin. Just put that little area in there. Again, doesn't necessarily need to come up to touch the sides of the other colors, the other tones just at the moment, because we're going to manipulate that together. And actually, when I have it on my brush, I notice there that the other side of where the stem comes out there is really very light. And then maybe what I'll do is, just to keep my sort of guidelines, I'll put a wee line down in here to suggest the stem. So what we've got is a set of blocks of tone where we believed them to be when we analysed that photograph. And what I'm going to do now is pull these together. So meld them, because we talked about the edges and we said, well, you know, we believe the edges to be quite soft. So this is where, when we come in now with our flat, very soft nylon brush, what I normally do is put the brush into a medium like liquid or like turpentine, and then actually clean it. The reason is that just leaves a residue of moisture barely on the brush, and it means that the brush flows a bit better and you don't get the paint sticking up in the fibers of it. But if we were to begin working crisscross between the tones now, so if I begin to blend these tones together, you can hear I think the noise as I'm doing that, back and forward, crisscross, diagonally, that way and that way, lightly, and just take time with it. Then clean the brush, because you're carrying paint across, remember, so you're liable to carry really dark from there to there, which you don't want if you can avoid it. And there we can see I'm tapping the edges so that they also softly meld together. And again, keep wiping, keep lightly brushing, and don't panic, you know, to get it done immediately. And yes, you will spread tone across, but that's the whole idea, that what we're trying to get is this lovely gentle gradation of greys. Okay, keep wiping. I can't stress that enough. It's very easy to forget about cleaning the brush, and then suddenly, you know, you get a lot of marks you don't want. Let's move up here and just tap that in, the softness of that. Just the edges there, wipe, tap, wipe, tap. And I'm barely stroking or scraping along the surface of the canvas or the board or whatever you call it here. And then the darker tones here, let's just tap the edges of them in, across, wipe again, tap that into that. Keep on wiping, keep on. So really it's all about, in a way, not only blended, but we are removing a certain amount of the tone, the color paint here onto this brush. That's why it's going onto this cloth. And then let's get to the highlight. Now we will lose some definition in it, which we will replace. What I'm saying is, as you can see, as I'm spreading that from the center out, you know, it's not as absolutely white as it would have been, but in a way that's not a bad thing, but we can replace it. What we're doing at least now is beginning to get a sense that there is a difference in light. Wiping, stroking, wiping again. Just fairly short brush marks is enough. And you can see, I hope, how the shapes that we had as these jelly bean shapes are now kind of relating together. I say, don't panic if you think you're losing that highlight. What you still have is a highlight compared to the rest, and then you can go back and refine that later. What we're in the business of doing right now is simply creating a three-dimensional solid form, the illusion of a solid form from shapes. Tapping's a nice technique where you're not stroking full on, you're just tapping with the brush, and just the marks you're making with the end of the brush are enough to blend. You see how they're softening the edges, constantly wiping with that bit of tissue there, getting rid of that, just tidying up that edge, tap. And as I said at the start of this video, this is quite a different approach to painting maybe to some of the other little lessons we've got, you know. And we know that there's still detail to go in this, but what we're beginning to get is the fundamental structure of it. We're getting something that is beginning to be passable as an apple, okay? And what we're going to do in a moment then, we're going to go back in and just refine some of those tones a little bit, because you will lose the stronger tones because we're so busy blending them together. But what we've got now is something that has that solid look, just moving the light slightly so that it doesn't shine on the glossy parts. So we're going to come back to that in a wee second. Now what I'm going to do, before I actually think about refining these tones and thinking about detail, I'm going to just kill off the brownness of the background, okay? So in other words, rather than it staying brown against grey, what I'm going to do is just gently, and I have quite a big round brush here actually, you can see that I'm using, just barely staying around there with a mid-grey. Now it may need to be changed, but I just felt I wanted the background to have a bit more relationship with the object. And you can hear, I hope, that, don't worry about going over that little stem, we're going to repaint all that shortly. And it's just enough to rub in a little bit of paint around there, just to take away that warmth. And maybe what we'll do before we get back into the apple is just give it somewhere to be. What I mean by that is, I'll just take my filbert brush again that I was using, and maybe just create something, suggest a table or something, so that it's not floating on the air without any reason. Okay, so that's just a slightly darker grey all the way around there. Now what you'll see is, obviously, if I put a darker grey there, it's close to the greys of the apple, so there are parts that may not jump out, so we'll have to, you know, tweak those later on. But the main thing is, now we have something solid like an apple sitting on a surface. Okay, just nice and boldly put that in, because we refine as we go. We don't finish things immediately, we work them up. Okay, so now we're in a position where we can sort of tidy this up a bit. So what I'm going to do now is just refine this a little bit, because as I said before, what's happened is, as we've blended these shapes together, we've carried one tone from another, Therefore, things that were looking very dark maybe aren't so dark. Things that were looking light aren't maybe so light because we've kind of exchanged tones. But what we have achieved is the form. But I would really quite like to go in and just tweak one or two parts. For instance, this area here, I think isn't as light overall. There's light on the side here, but this area is maybe just not quite as bright. So what I'm going to do is go in with a little deeper grey, but not as deep as what we have on the that side. On the right hand side, you can see I'm just bringing that down a little bit more. And it may be that what we do is we bring it all down bit by bit. What I mean by that is if we bring this down, I'm kind of mixing this into the wet paint. If I bring this down to a slightly deeper grey here, but not just as dark as that, and bring that round so that we just allow the light to happen on this side from about that point there. Okay, and then this mid area here is just slightly less grey. Again, I'm not blending it at the minute. As long as the paint is wet, and oil paint will stay wet for some time, so that's why this is a great advantage of it. Going up here, I'm looking at the photograph thinking, well, you know, I actually think some of that tone could be a bit darker. So again, I'm just going to touch a little few parts around there, that shape there, not blending it right now, and let that come down here because I think it stretches down the side, but again, we're not blending it. And while I have the dark on my brush, I actually think, you know, we maybe could afford to come in here and get some lovely deep areas up around here on the shoulder of the apple, as it were, here. So we'll maybe let that become nice and dark, that section there. So we've created a shape of dark right there, which again will blend in a moment. And likewise, when we get right down to the bottom of the apple, the shadows or the light that may not be getting down there, we can maybe say, okay, let's put that nice and dark there as a solid shape. So the shapes look a bit odd sitting on top in a minute, but hopefully we'll push them back into place. What I'm doing now is I'm changing brushes, that little fine number 2 brush, just because I want to get into a couple of smaller bits, namely this area where the stem appears. So what we have is a sort of an ellipse here. If you watch look at the photograph, you'll see a sort of elliptical shape like that. And inside that is a dark tone. So again, I'm just painting it like an elliptical shape there at the moment, not doing anything else. We said that was already very light, and I kind of like that. But what I do notice is there is a little bit of shadow going over that way, out of this shadow here. So block that in. So where you see something, just put it in as a patch. And don't worry if it works perfectly or it doesn't work perfectly. This is about the exercise, okay? And we can go on like this for some time, because I'm actually, as I'm talking, I'm looking all the time at the photograph and thinking, you know what, I said that was a bit darker there, and I would quite like that to be darker, coming over like that, and like I did earlier. So this top bit kind of stretches a bit more here, and maybe a wee creep up there as well. So they're just blocks of color. Now what I'll do is I'll start to think about melding these together. Okay, so we'll get our nice flat nylon brush on the go here, this thing here, and again, be ready with your rag, your tissue to wipe, and very, very gently start that tapping process again. So I'm tapping this time. I'm even moving less this time. I'm trying to avoid stroking too hard this time, because I want to keep those shapes kind of in place. So look, I've softened that one a little bit. I'm going to soften this one that way, up behind the back of the apple there. Okay, I'll come down to the side of the apple now and meld that grey into that darker grey. Tap, tap, tap. Wipe again. Stretch that colour into, or that tone into the next tone. So we want the situation where we're not aware of separate shapes, that the shapes slowly meld together, so that it's very hard to say where one edge was and where the other one met that edge, and so on. But yet we want to retain where dark and light is, so it's just super soft shapes is what we're creating. Wipe the brush again, tapping that edge until that hard edge disappears, and then that piece that I did earlier there, we'll wipe the brush there and just drag it over into the slightly darker tones. Wipe brush, drag diagonally back the other way, constantly moving, swinging back and forward, tapping, wiping. And even just this activity, just this technique of putting two colors together or two tones and tapping them into each other until you create a soft gradation. You could actually do that as a separate exercise, and it's one of the most useful things as a technique. I'm going to stretch this down here like that around that highlight, and we're going to replace the highlight because you can see it's beginning to disappear slightly because of all the work we're doing here. Wipe again, get down here, get rid of that hard edge on that line, soften, soften. And it is a relatively slow process, and some would say quite tedious, but if you persist with it, I mean, I'm just stroking that canvas and no more. I've said in other videos, you've probably seen them, pretend that what you're doing is flicking dust off a valuable object. You barely want to touch it, but in case you push it over, try to have that mentality about how lightly we're stroking this surface here, and that's how lightly we are. And then we'll just have a wee look at this area here. We'll just gently tap, tap, tap that, wipe, tap, just so that that does not appear to be too hard. A little dark bit I put in there, you can see. So you can see now how that's beginning to give some illusion, if you like, of the little delve in there. And what I'm going to do is carry that shadow up slightly, simply because it would probably carry up very slightly anyway, but it also just defines it against the background there. If you notice the way I made the background lighter. So what I'm going to do is just make that edge, wee bit of paint, and then again tap, tap, until it melds and it starts to feel like it's part of the one unit, the one object. We bring it in there too, we tap, white brush. That's all the paint, very tiny amount, tapping it, tapping it, tapping it, until we're creating. We're going to put the stem in a wee moment or two, but we're beginning slowly but surely. And what I might do is the same thing here, very slightly edge that for the sake of my painting. Just create, if you have a rounded object, you'll either have dark, dark, or light, dark, light. You usually will not just have dark and light. It will rotate because obviously it's a circular object, especially if it is a circular object or spherical object. So we get that dark edge. See what I'm doing? Just dragging that until it's just about there. I want to drag it a wee bit more. You have to be like me, quite obsessive, but that's not a bad thing, you know, when you're painting things like this. I'm just gonna cut that across there. That's annoying me slightly because when I'm looking at it, I see a little bit of light catching the top of it there. It's very, very light, but it doesn't matter. I'll take that and just with the clean brush soften that in there. So I'm kind of finding excuses to lift it away from the background. But two things are happening, I hope. One is that the object's starting to look shinier, and secondly, it's beginning to look three-dimensional. So what I'm going to do is just, beg your pardon, need to lean here. Just put a wee line in there just to remind me that I want to get that as a stem later on. So it's not a particularly well drawn, but it's just to remind me that I want to put a stem in there. So now I think we're beginning to get something. Looking at the background, there's a little light edge there. Do you see that? This little light halo, which is kind of annoying me because it just jumps against the thing. So you see when I just got rid of it there, that apple sits a wee bit better. And I suppose what we'll do before going further is maybe saying, well, look, let's pretend or let's imagine it is some sort of shadow coming out here. So put a little bit of shadow underneath, let it stretch that way, because obviously the light is coming from our left side. Just put a wee bit of shadow, just push it across there. Remember, this exercise is not about shadows, but we might as well put something in there to create some sort of illusion. So we're going to let that sit for a second, and we'll come back. I'll show you what we're going to do next. So what we have here is basically a solid form that's beginning to look like an apple. And we did it by first establishing the S shapes, remember? Drew the shapes as we see them. Then we looked at tones. We said, okay, that shape is very dark, that shape is slightly lighter, that shape is so on. And we try to occupy these, in this case, with grey. Then we looked at the edges, the E. So we took those shapes and we realized that the edges were very soft. The gradation from one shape to another was soft. So we blended and blended the edges until we create that softness. Now what we're going to do is we're going to let that sit. I could spend many, many hours if I wished working this up and looking at the refined lights and shades. And you could do that too if you wish. But for this exercise, we're going to keep it simple enough that we get to this stage where we have a solid looking apple. And what I'm going to do is this is going to dry, and then we're going to apply color on top of that in the form of glazes and what's known as scumbling. And also we're going to put little marks and details using the same very, very thin sort of glazing technique. Okay, everybody, we're at the next stage, I hope anyway. This apple is now dry, completely dry. The one that we made in this in monochrome and black and white. And now what I want to do is begin to introduce color. And this can be quite a nerve-wracking part of it because it is relatively delicate. What I'd like to show you is my palette that I'm working from. You can see there, working actually from this side, we have lemon yellow, alizarin crimson, and down here we have a little vermilion, which is a warmer red. So you have that deep crimson, you have that slightly warmer, lighter red of vermilion, and some lemon yellow there. This is a mixture I've been doing of these two in case I need it, the crimson and lemon, but it may be that what I get will do me from these. The secret now is dilution, because we're really going to apply very, very, very thin glazes to this image, to this painting. So I will be using a very soft brush. In fact, the little soft square brush I used earlier when I was putting the black and white on. It's nice and clean now, I hope, and nice and soft. And what I'm using as a medium is my Liquin again. Now, as I say, you don't have to use Liquin. I just happen to have some. It's that medium that dries quickly when you add it to paints, but you can also use turpentine or a mixture of turpentine and linseed. The reason why, if you have linseed, use it, it gives just a stickier substance, which means it tends to stick better on top of the underpainting. But for the sake of the exercise, if you only have turpentine, then that's okay. But really, if you're only using turpentine, honestly, you'll probably need just the tiniest amount on your brush, because paints are all transparent. All paints are see-through, really, even pretty much most of the whites. I mean, if I was to take another brush here, well, you can see here as I've scraped the red, you can see through it already onto the white. and the same with the lemon and the vermilion and everything else. So we're not necessarily loading up these with oils so it's dripping everywhere. In fact, it might be that I eventually be just taking a little bit of that pretty dry and rubbing it. You can see even on the palette, if I take a little tiny bit and rub it hard, it becomes see-through. So that's what I want to do to this. Okay, so any medium I'm using will be extremely light. Okay, what I'm doing now is I'm adding a tiniest bit of that liquid to the crimson, and you can see the consistency there. Okay, I'll just set that down for a second so you can see this. What I'm going to do is load the brush up, and I'm actually going to just soak away some off the brush because I just want to see. I don't know if you see in the back of my hand. You see how little I want to apply here? That's the sort of delicacy that I'm going to apply to the painting. When I looked at the photograph, I noticed that this side of the painting was warmer, more leaning slightly towards the orangey side. This side was certainly cooler and darker, very deep crimson, which is why I've got crimson on the brush here. So I'm just going to patch in areas of color, but with extreme delicacy. And you can see now, I'll just get my soft brush, which is what I really want. Get some more of that crimson on that nice soft nylon. And I'm just going to apply that really almost like a varnish, because the grey will then shine through and integrate with this crimson kind of varnish that I've put on. And I'll rub it out a wee bit, almost to the halfway mark, and rub a little bit over here. I'm leaving little bits here because I think there's little bits of yellow and things. So, you know, I'm just playing around with this at the moment. You can hear me rubbing, I think, and that's how transparent this color really is. Now I'm giving the brush a clean, taking the tiniest bit of liquid again. This time I'm going to go in with the vermilion, which is now if you don't have vermilion, by the way, cadmium red is fine. By the way, I didn't mention that, but I should have. So a little bit of vermilion, and you'll see that this side is a warmer red than that. But again, putting it on with a soft, super soft brush. Don't worry about going over the light area, because you'll see that it takes on a nice color, and we can sort that out later anyway. But the main body of the apple, I'm blending the vermilion or the cadmium red into the crimson here. And I have, because I'm putting it on so thin, I have a wee bit of scope for putting more on. But in reality, what happened with the old masters and whatever, they would have put this on and built layers upon layers of it, you know, so it wouldn't have been just, they would have let it dry and applied more. But we'll work with that. What I'm going to do now is I knew there was a little bit of a yellowish tint in the apple, as I remember, so I'm going to, again, very thin. In fact, I'll use my hand, which is probably not good enough. You can see how little tint of yellow is on my hand there. But I'm going to put a wee tap in there, just around the top. You know, it might go a bit green because there's grey on it, remember? Or grey underneath it. I'll push it around like that and blend it in a little bit to the crimson, but not too much. I don't want to overdo it. But you can see there is that little hint of yellow going on there. What I might do is go back just momentarily to the crimson, put a little bit round the back of the apple here. You can see that going on. And again, clean the brush. There's plenty of paint on there. I don't need any more. It's almost like watercolor, the transparency of the paint. Well, in fact, it is. It's see-through, so I'm just tinting that across. So there's a bit of color everywhere now on the apple. And this is quite, you know, it's still damp, which is good. So what I can do then in the dampness is begin to introduce other things. So if I take, I'm adding a little bit of, I'll just bring the palette over, I'm adding a little bit of a yellow. I'm going to add some into that cadmium there. I'm just making, see that's a slightly more orangey color there because I've mixed the yellow into the cadmium. But again, look when I stroke my brush, there's hardly any on there. There's just enough on the end of that brush. So what I'm going to do very carefully is go back in here and dab a little bit of that. You can see hopefully the slightly tint of a warmer orange going on there. But you see what's happening is the form of the apple has been established by black and white. So it's already kind of three-dimensional. And all I'm doing now is tinting on the color. And likewise, I could go in, I'm going in now with a little bit of deeper, slightly deeper crimson. Or another layer of crimson if you like. And I'm going to get that in there. And I keep my hand out of the way as much as I can. That's a bit darker there. And again, cleaning the brush. And then just using the paint I have to spread it around gently. Just like we did, tapping and feathering the paint very, very delicately over towards the middle. And at this point, you see, you can kind of experiment, as I said before. Don't worry that, you know, my goodness, this is not exactly the same colors as the apple right at the minute. But you can build it and build it. I'm going to clean the brush again, tap that round there. And just allow that to come across. Maybe stretch it right over there a little bit. So we're getting a wee bit of form going across the apple. And maybe brown at the bottom. Clean the brush again. Feather that in, and I have a line here which I don't like, so I'm just going to try and blend that. But you can see through the color, and it's the grey and black and white which is changing the color. So I'm not making up lots of different colors of shades of red here. I'm just putting on one or two reds, and the greys beneath are changing it for me. And that was the principle used so often by the old masters. And if you overdid highlights, you could go back in and use what sometimes they term scumbling, or using a white, but again in a very transparent way. But what we're beginning to get here, I'm going to go in with a little bit of yellow, tiny touch there, look, on that wee bit. Clean the brush and just rub it in and let the greys come through it to whatever extent you want, so you can have that little bit of yellowy tint there. So I'm not modeling with the modeling's been done. The three-dimensional feel of the apple has been achieved when we did it with black and white. All we're doing now is tinting it. And I don't know if any of you might have done the same, but I know when I was a kid, we used to play around with the old photographs. We used to find and colour them in, tint them with wee paints and things, And that's the same principle. So I'm just trying to edge that a wee bit more. Bring that red over slightly into the rest of it. And again, I'm just, that thing I mentioned about, I'm just going to wipe that back to the edge. Which is, by the way, another little technique. Because the oil is so oily and the paint below is dry, it's okay to wipe that away, because you kind of know that the colours or the tone below is okay, and you can repaint and whatever. But we're beginning to get now a red apple, which was black and white, and we're beginning to get tints. And as I say, we could let that dry, and I'm just enjoying this here, because I think that could be darker. Remember, I said we normally have dark, light, and dark, or light, dark, light. One or other of those patterns. So if if I just use that thin paint just to go over the darker grey that I had, and then cleaning the brush again, and then just gently tapping the edge of that so that it fades in, so we have a nice illusion that there's just a hint of shadow on the other side as well. I think it helps round the apple up slightly there. But there, if I do this again, oh, pardon my hands, but if I do that with a brush, look, you don't see anything coming off. But there is just enough on the end of that brush to do what I've been doing here. So that is the delicacy in it. It's one of the mistakes a lot of us tend to make, is to forget that oils can be used with incredible delicacy, just like they can be used super thick and chunky and with the palette knife and all the rest of it. You can do all sorts of things like that. This is still wet, but I might just try and see. I'm taking a very slightly stiffer brush, this wee filbert there. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take and actually find, if I can find it, a little bit here of zinc white, which zinc white is a transparent white. It's a white that's quite see-through. And you can see there, it's sitting right there. And if I put the tiniest bit on the end of my brush, you can barely see it, but there is paint there. And again, if I want, I can put a little bit of that zinc white. Ideally, I think what I would do is would have let this dry first, and until I'm happy, and then go in dry. But since we're trying to demonstrate this, I'm going to try a chance working it in wet. You can see how tiny that piece of paint is, and I'm just cleaning my brush, so there's no paint on the brush. It's only that wee tiny spot. And just like we did earlier, I'm just rubbing, and because zinc is a transparent white, it softens very quickly, and it's a lovely sort of method to create, just bring up highlight, so that you just have a nice soft highlight rather than a big flash of color. And you can use it, even what's on the brush there, you can't see, but you can use it to suggest. If I rub in there, I don't know if you can see the slightest bit of color on there. Maybe got a wee bit of grey, but because I'm mixing around. But you can use it in a lovely sort of way. Sometimes, as you know, you'll get a reflection glanced into the other side of the apple. Maybe a slight ghost of a reflection on a shiny apple there. You see in there? Let's put a tiny little bit more in there. Just tap it in. One wee stroke is enough. Clean the brush. Now the brush is your tool for blending. And then again, just ever so lightly stretch that. And it just helps give a feeling that maybe something's being reflected on the other side of the apple. So our apple is becoming shinier now. And fundamentally, it comes down to the very beginning of what we said. We looked at shapes, S. We looked at tones. We put down the various greys underneath here. We looked at the edges. So we said, well, the edges are soft. So we blended those greys together as we believed they should be. So we organized the edges into each other. And then the last thing would be marks. So we first of all have applied color. Now, if you have, which you sometimes get in apples, little marks and things. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to try and very quickly, I'm going to use my crimson and a tiniest wee bit of black, actually, just for this purpose. So it's a muddy, almost plum color. But if again, I would ideally like this to dry, but for the purpose of the exercise, let's say we have an apple that has some marks. Now, here is where we've worked before. It looks at first like, you know, bizarrely spotty sort of thing. But if we go in there with a decent firm brush, you know, like that sort of hugger, and tap again, and just work these in so that they almost begin to disappear. We leave behind the dregs of them, which is just enough to suggest little marks that you can get on an apple, you know. And we can work again and it takes a while, you know, and again, I'm inventing this to some extent, but just to let you see. So initially what you have is, looks a bit ridiculous, but when I go in and you see my hands down that, I'm not going in stabbing it with the front of the brush. I'm going in sideways like that, tapping gently and moving, and watch all the time what's happening. And then what you're doing is deciding how much to leave behind, basically. How many of these little suggested marks. There's just a wee ghost left behind. You can see there, and we can, if we want, begin just enough to create the surface of these little petty things, little marks that you can get on an apple sometimes, and maybe they're brown and so on. So what I've done here is just to sort of play around with the image a little bit more. You maybe notice what I've done is I've deepened the lower part, let's call it the table, and deepened the shadow beneath, just to give a weight, you know, a greater sense of weight to the apple itself. And also in the background here, what I've done is vary the light and shade. I thought, well, I'll have a lighter tone here, gradually fading back towards a slightly deeper, cooler tone over here, just to give a sense maybe that there's light shining on the apple. But I've been looking at it for a little longer and thought, you know, it might be kind of nice. The apple's slightly drier now, and I thought it might be kind of nice to go back in with this sort of cadmium, or rather vermilion as I'm using, but you can use cadmium too, a warmer red basically. And again, very thin. Again, you can see the dilution of that. I'm sure that's not good for my skin, I don't know. But I'm just going to play with warming it up a bit in the middle here. Just giving a light rub there. And again, just with the brush feathering all the time. You can see how that's beginning very slightly to add warmth in that middle area there. So I'll keep brushing that. And you can see that the warmer glow is kind of happening there. And it is just the slightest of tints. You can see that begin to happen. I'll bring it round there as well, so that the whole of that side creates a little bit more warmth. And I'm just stroking very carefully, because I think actually one of the layers beneath might be slightly wet. So as I say, ideally you dry between each glaze. Really, that is the ideal situation. But you can see that, for instance, the zinc white that I put on is still slightly wet. So I'm kind of working against that. But, you know, let's just feather it in and see. The main thing I wanted to do was try and just bring out that warmth there, and the fact that the illusion, I should say, that there may be some glossiness to the apple, maybe enhancing that a little bit more, so you can see. But the more I work, the more things I see, you know. But let's say we've brought it up a little bit more there. As I say, I do feel you can see some little streaks there, and the reason for that simply is that the underglaze, the glaze we put on in the last stage there a moment ago, is still damp, and therefore my brush is streaking through it a little bit. And this is why the old masters and their apprentices in a lot of cases went away, dried the thing, came back, glazed it, dried it, glazed it, and you know, maybe 14, 15 glazes or maybe more. But you know, that was no problem. But you can see that the apple really is shining now, I think, and I'm kind of happy with that. You know, again, being the obsessive that I am, you know, I kind of wonder what would happen if I get a little bit more depth around the back there. And again, I'm sure that'll go streaky maybe, but you know, what's the worst that can happen? You know, if it does, then we push on. It's an exercise. We're not here to prepare for some big exhibition or something like that. We're just learning is basically it. and you can see the glow there. And what I might do just very gently is just replace that little bit of light. See that tiny little dot there? And just what is in that dot can spread, you see, considerably. How much that little dot of paint changed that little bit of highlight there, you know. So anyway, before I get myself again totally bogged down in the activity of painting, just thinking about a nice deep edge there, look, just to strengthen the shadow on that side of the apple. Cleaning the brush again, then with a pretty much a clean brush I'm tapping that in, as I've done with everything else. Clean it, and then just soften that line ever so slightly so that it's not a hard line, and maybe enhance that sense of a hole being down in there. But like everything else, you can play with these images until the cows come home, or the apples come home, if you like. So have a think about all of that, and let me see the results of your own work.